For centuries, saints have been celebrated as shining examples of divine virtue. Their images fill cathedrals, their names echo through prayers, and their stories inspire millions. We see them in glowing stained glass, cast in marble with halos of gold, symbols of holiness, purity, and sacrifice. But what if those halos hide shadows? What if the people we venerate as saints were more complex, even controversial? What if behind the miracles and martyrdoms are stories the Church doesn't want us to question, stories of violence, political agendas, ambition, and deeply human flaws? You see, sainthood is not just about faith. It's also about power, who gets remembered, who gets silenced, and why. Over the centuries, many saints were chosen not just for their piety, but for how well their image served the Church's needs. Some were fast-tracked to sainthood under suspicious circumstances. Others led crusades, supported inquisitions, or were involved in disturbing acts, all while being praised as holy figures. So tonight, we're peeling back the veil. We'll look beyond the polished legends and into the forgotten facts, controversial canonizations, and strange stories, history buried beneath devotion. Because even saints had secrets, and not all of them were divine. Let's discuss the ideal image versus reality. For most of us, saints are seen as flawless beings, living embodiments of divine virtue, untouched by the ordinary struggles of human life. They are remembered for their miracles, their piety, and their unwavering devotion. Their images shine brightly in churches and cathedrals, sculpted in stone or painted in glowing colors, symbols of hope and holiness. But history tells a more complicated story. Behind these carefully curated images are human beings, people who lived in turbulent times, made difficult choices, and were often far from perfect. Many saints were not just spiritual leaders, but political figures, warriors, and power players of their time. Their actions, viewed through a modern lens, raise difficult questions. Take Saints Cyril and Methodius, for example. Today, they are celebrated as missionaries who spread Christianity among the Slavic peoples. But their legacy includes the forced conversion of entire regions, conversions that were not always peaceful or voluntary. Or consider Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. A towering figure in medieval Christianity, he was revered for his intellect and devotion. Yet, he was also a fierce supporter of the Second Crusade, using his influence to promote a war that led to untold violence and suffering in the name of faith. These are not isolated cases. Time and again, we find that the saints we were taught to admire lived in a complex moral world. They navigated political pressures, cultural conflicts, and personal ambition, just like anyone else. And yet, their stories were later reshaped, edited, and elevated into near perfection by those who followed. The question is not whether they were good or bad, but whether we've been told the full truth. What happens when we strip away the halo and look at the person beneath? Let's discuss controversial canonizations. Not every saint is canonized for spiritual greatness alone. Sometimes the reasons are far more strategic, tied to power, politics, and influence inside the Church. Canonization, by definition, is supposed to be the recognition of a life marked by exceptional holiness. But what happens when sainthood is granted not because of virtue, but because of connections? In recent decades, the process of sainthood has faced intense scrutiny, especially when it's fast-tracked. One such case is that of Saint Josemaria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, a powerful and highly controversial Catholic organization. Escrivá was canonized in 2002, less than 30 years after his death, a remarkably short time frame by Vatican standards. His supporters claim he brought spirituality into everyday life and promoted holiness in the workplace. But critics describe him and Opus Dei as authoritarian, secretive, and cult-like in their control over members. Former followers have accused the group of psychological manipulation, forced obedience, and created a rigid internal hierarchy. Yet, despite these concerns, Escrivá's canonization moved forward swiftly, backed by powerful allies within the Vatican. And he's not alone. Several canonizations throughout history appear to have been influenced by political agendas, not personal sanctity. In some cases, the Church seemed to elevate certain figures to reinforce institutional control, secure alliances, or silence dissenting voices. Fast-tracked sainthood often bypasses deeper investigation. Miracles are questioned, warnings are ignored, and voices of opposition, especially from those within the church, are sometimes suppressed. This raises a disturbing question. Is sainthood always earned, or can it be arranged? The deeper you look, the more it becomes clear that sainthood isn't always about divine inspiration. At times, it has been a carefully calculated move, used to shape public opinion, reward loyalty, and preserve influence. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. Once someone is canonized, their image is locked in time as untouchable, unquestionable, and beyond critique. But history has a way of reopening even the most sacred of files. Let's discuss saints and violence. Not all saints were peaceful figures. In fact, some actively promoted or took part in violence convinced it served a divine purpose. One of the most striking examples is Saint Louis IX, King of France. He is remembered as a pious ruler, deeply devoted to the church, but he also led 2 bloody crusades in the 13th century wars marked by mass killings, looting, and forced conversions. Entire regions were left in ruins, all under the banner of holy war. And yet, Louis was canonized less than 30 years after his death. He's not alone. Throughout history, many saintly figures supported acts of violence if they believed it was for the protection or expansion of the faith. Some were vocal advocates of the Inquisition, a brutal campaign by the Church to root out heresy. Torture, imprisonment, and execution were justified as necessary evils to preserve the purity of belief. These acts were often cloaked in righteousness. The suffering inflicted was seen not as cruelty, but as obedience to God's will. And those who carried it out, no matter how severe their actions were, later honored as saints. But what does it mean when a holy figure sheds blood in the name of faith? It challenges the very idea of sainthood. Were these actions heroic or horrific? Acts of devotion or domination? The truth is, sainthood has never been separated from the era in which it was shaped. What was once praised as religious duty may now be seen as moral failure. And while the Church often highlights their piety, it rarely speaks of the pain they caused. Because in the pursuit of holiness, history shows, not all saints kept their hands clean. Let's discuss mystical or madness. Not all saints fought in wars or led crusades. Some claim to experience something far stranger: visions, voices, and encounters with the divine. They spoke of hearing God, of seeing angels, and of being called to carry out divine missions. To the faithful, these experiences were miraculous. To skeptics even today, they raise a difficult question. Were these saints touched by God, or suffering from something more human? Take St. Catherine of Siena, for example. She experienced visions from an early age, claimed to receive messages directly from Christ, and reported mystical marriages to Jesus himself. During her lifetime, she was revered but also feared. She went long periods without food, claimed to survive only on the Eucharist, and wrote letters commanding popes and kings. Then, there's Saint Teresa of Avila, who described ecstatic visions so intense that they left her physically trembling. Her descriptions of spiritual rapture bordered on the erotic, so much so that they raised suspicion even within the Church, and yet her experiences became the foundation of Christian mysticism. Modern psychologists have studied these accounts, and some believe these saints may have suffered from dissociative disorders, schizophrenia, or extreme fasting-induced hallucinations. But rather than question them, the Church interpreted these behaviors as signs of divine favor. Fainting spells, starvation, and self-inflicted suffering were often seen as proof of spiritual purity. These mystical saints were canonized, venerated, and held up as holy examples. But behind the awe lies an uncomfortable reality. What if their most sacred moments were symptoms of untreated mental illness? What if the Church, in its search for holiness, mistook psychological trauma for divine intervention? And if that's true, how many other saints were never prophets? But patience the world misunderstood. Let's discuss suppressed stories and forgotten saints. Not every saint remains a saint forever. Throughout history, some figures once venerated by millions have been quietly removed, demoted, or forgotten by the Church without fanfare, without explanation. One of the most well-known examples is Saint Christopher. For centuries, he was one of the most popular saints in Christendom, the patron of travelers, his image worn around the necks of millions. Churches were dedicated in his name. His feast day was widely celebrated. But in 1969, his official status was revised. He was removed from the universal calendar of saints, his story deemed more legend than fact. No scandal, no controversy, just silence. And he's not alone. There are saints whose stories became too strange, too questionable, or too difficult to verify for the modern church. Some were based on local folklore, others had no historical evidence to support their existence at all. A few were even believed to be invented to serve specific political or theological purposes. Rather than openly confront these inconsistencies, the church often chooses quiet erasure. Their names fade from feast days, their images are removed from walls, their stories slowly disappear. But why? The truth is, sainthood is not just about holiness, it's also about control. The church must maintain consistency, credibility, and authority. When a saint's story no longer fits the official narrative, it becomes a liability. So, they're forgotten, not condemned, not criticized, just edited out of history. But these forgotten saints raise important questions. Who decides which lives are worth remembering? And how many saints, once revered as divine, were erased because they no longer served the church's needs? Sometimes, the most revealing stories are the ones no longer told. Let's discuss conclusion and why it matters. Sainthood, like history itself, is rarely black and white. Behind every halo is a human being flawed, complicated, and shaped by their time. The church has long promoted saints as moral guides, symbols of perfect faith and virtue. But in doing so, it often hides their full story. The violence, the politics, the suffering, the doubt. Why does this matter? Because understanding the truth doesn't weaken faith, it deepens it. When we see saints as real people, not unreachable icons, their struggles become more meaningful, and their stories more honest. We're not here to discredit belief, but to seek the full picture, to ask what was left out and why. Because even saints walked through shadows. The question is, why does the church only show us the light? Thank you for watching The Dark Side of Saints. If you found this eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold truths and hidden histories. Leave your thoughts in the comments, we're just getting started.